Next, let's dig into Chapter 2, which talks about ethical and legal issues for career professionals. There are lots of different considerations when it comes to legal and ethical issues in career work. Again, thinking broadly about the concept of career and how we integrate this into general counseling practice. So we want to attend to a lot of the same considerations that we do in any kind of counseling work, attending to things like confidentiality, informed consent, making sure that we're working within our appropriate practice, our scope of practice in the state that we're in, and our appropriate licensing. Noting that in some states in the US, you can practice career counseling without having any kind of independent mental health counseling licensing or having any kind of school certification. For example, in the state of California, if you are designated only as a career counselor, you don't have to have any licensing, meaning that there is no board overseeing your work to make sure that you are practicing ethically. So it's important to be aware of the scope of practice in your state where you are and attending to the licensing regulations that govern your practice in that state. Especially thinking about in the realm of the counseling compact, where we're going to have more and more individuals practicing in multiple states. It's really important to note and adhere to the regulations of each state where your client is located. So if you're working with clients in multiple states, you need to be familiar with the scope of practice, licensing, and ethical guidelines that govern the states of where those different clients are located, not just in the home state where you live. We need to attend to adequate record keeping and adherence to things like HIPAA laws and FERPA laws, attending to the privacy in all aspects of our work. So thinking about things like encryption and making sure that we are storing records appropriately. And then thinking about ethical use of technology, which we will dig in just a little bit more later in this chapter. When we're thinking about ethical practice, when it comes to career work, there might be a couple of different ethical guidelines that we would work from. So of course we have the ACA Code of Ethics, and that has, among other things, principles within the preamble of autonomy, non-maleficence, beneficence, justice, fidelity, and veracity. These refer to the idea that as counselors, we should always promote the autonomy of our clients to make their own choices. We should never do harm if we can avoid doing harm. We certainly never want to intentionally do harm. We always want to act in the best interests of the client. We want to treat clients fairly, and we want to interact with clients in a way that preserves their trust and demonstrates honesty as much as possible. So, National Career Development Association, or NCDA, created their own ethical standards that were published in 2015 that roughly mirrored the brand new Code of Ethics that came out the year prior. So the NCDA standards, which are linked in the module for this week, roughly mirror the code, and they address things like respect for clients, professional responsibility in career work, integrity, confidentiality, cultural competence in our career work, ethical and legal standards of practice, professional relationships with clients, research and publication related to career work, professional development for career professionals, and social responsibility to promote social justice in our work related to career development. You can see a lot of similarities here between NCDA and the ACA Code of Ethics. The big key difference is NCDA is an interdisciplinary organization. So their ethical practice is for career professionals across different fields, not only those who identify as counselors in their professional identity. But again, we see a lot of similarities here when it comes to the ACA Code and NCDA. We, of course, also want to remember the idea of ethical decision-making and using ethical decision-making models, which is highlighted in both set of ethical codes. So let's talk about some different ethical codes from the ACA Code of Ethics that address career. And a lot of these are going to be found in the assessment section of the ACA Code of Ethics. So we have E2A, which you see listed here, talking about assessment, and the purpose of assessment is information gathering as opposed to a more prescriptive focus. So take this test and therefore you should be a veterinarian. So we're using these as information gathering tools to help support the idea of client decision making, treatment planning, or any kind of legal or forensic proceedings. And so we want to make sure that we're using assessments appropriately in career work. Also, we have some different codes. E2A, that talks about counselors only using assessments which they are trained and competent to use. E2B, which says that counselors are responsible for appropriately applying, scoring, and interpreting assessments relevant to the needs of the client and also with fidelity to the development of the instrument. So we don't want to just give assessments because we want to make sure they really connect to treatment plans and the needs and goals of the client or student that we're working with. E3A talks about before assessment, we should always explain the nature and purpose of the assessment and how we're going to use the outcome of the assessment so we can get an additional layer of informed consent before we use any sort of career-related assessments in counseling work. And E3B, which talks about counselors needing to include accurate and appropriate interpretation of any outcomes when they are providing results with clients. So we can't just give assessments and then not follow up the client. We have to walk them through either through written report or verbal interpretation, explaining what outcomes of results mean. And you'll get to practice this in the course when you get to do some peer assessment and interpretation of outcomes with each other. The final one code that we have listed here is F8B, which talks about counselor educators specifically, so your instructors, have an ethical obligation to provide a career advisement for our counseling students. So we have to help you as students connect with career opportunities that are going to be most aligned with your goals and make sure you're aware of all opportunities that are available to you. As a follow-up to the NCDA Code of Ethics, NCDA also put out an addendum to this, or a complementary document that talks about ethical use of social networking and technology in career-related services. This was also published in 2015, and you'll see as you flip through it that it probably needs some updating just because both career work and technology have evolved a whole lot in the last 9 years. So especially in the last, I would say 2 or 3 years. So when we're thinking about use of things like social media and social networking in career work, NCDA has provided some guidance, and this is linked in the module for this week. So in terms of ethical use of social networking, NCDA addresses the idea of privacy and self-determination in decisions to use and engage with social networking technology or not. And they reference things like LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, which is now called X, Pinterest, and several other networking platforms. This was before the age of things like TikTok. And so there's a lot of more current technology and platforms that we use that are not accounted for, but could easily have applied the principles that they have offered in this document to those platforms as well. When thinking about confidentiality, so when engaging with social networking technologies as therapists and in supporting our clients, thinking about confidentiality, and the ACA Code of Ethics generally advises counselors to have separate identities and presence online when it comes to promoting your business or promoting your professional identity and your personal. So you should always have separate social networking handles or pages when it comes to promoting your work as opposed to your personal adventures that you might have out in the world. We also want to always use informed consent and transparency when it comes to engaging technology in our work with our clients. So we want to make sure that clients have an option and a choice in the way that we're engaging technologies in our work, and transparency about how and why we're using them. We want to make sure that we're using techniques, tools, and resources that we know enough about So we worked through them before, we've been exposed to them before, and we generally know the risks and benefits to using them before we bring them into session. Of course, we always want to adhere to principles of data security and HIPAA and FERPA, and we want to make sure that we're engaging clients with fair treatment and equitable access. So digital equity is a consideration, and we learned this in the pandemic when we moved schools and work online and quickly determined that not everyone has adequate broadband at their home, not everyone has adequate technology to access internet-based connections in their home. And so when we're bringing in technology tools or we're engaging clients in things like telehealth, we want to make sure that there's equitable access to the tools and supports and infrastructure that is needed. And we're also adequately training and supporting those clients to have the digital skills to be able to access and use those tools. And then there's always competence. So we want to make sure that as professionals, we're very aware and trained and knowledgeable in what we're engaging and what we're bringing into the counseling session. So final note here related to ethics and legal issues. Of course, we could dig a whole lot deeper into the idea of ethics and legal issues, and you have an entire course on that. So we're just going to hit briefly on the American School Counseling Association Code of Ethics. So career development and career awareness is a very big portion of the ASCA national model. And so for school counselors, talking about the idea of career awareness is a big part of what we do. And so there are some codes in ASCA's guidelines that specifically address the idea of engagement and career awareness within the general roles, responsibilities, and engagement of school counselors in school environments. So just briefly, again, the entirety of the ASCA code is linked in the module for this week, in addition to some other resources related to the Counseling Compact and ethical practice in telehealth. So just briefly, an overview here, ASCA addresses these things throughout the code, but specifically in A4A, which talks about collaborating with stakeholders to create a culture of post-secondary readiness. And when they talk about post-secondary, that could refer to job training, that could refer to higher education or apprenticeships. A4B talks about school counselors advocating for students' career awareness, exploration, and planning, and decision-making with an inclusive array of options. A4C talks about identifying and examining gaps in access to college and career readiness and biases that exist in these areas. A4D talks about students developing a positive attitude towards learning strategies, management, and skills that are transferable to career success. A4E talks about addressing personal biases related to choices in post-secondary options. And then A4F is advocating, so addressing inequitable systemic policies and practices that create barriers to students having access to post-secondary choices. So there's a lot of considerations here when it comes to school counseling practice and ethical practice of career awareness.